Good morning, everyone. We welcome you to the meeting for the Board of Trustees for the Utah Transit Authority. Today is Wednesday, September the 2nd of 2020, and I'm joined by my colleagues, Beth Holbrook and Kent Millington, and we certainly look forward to some important discussions today. But just make note that as we begin, due to and ask Jana Osler if she'll read a statement in regards to our electronic meeting today. Morning, Jana.
Good morning, Chair. Thank you. This is the electronic board meeting determination that allows us to continue with remote meetings during the pandemic period. And I will read the statement. Consistent with provisions of the Utah Open and Public Meetings Act, specifically Utah Code 52-4-207, Section 4, and acting in my capacity as the Chair of the Board of Trustees of the Utah Transit Authority, I hereby make the following written determinations in support of my decision to hold and convene electronic meetings of the UTA Board without a physical anchor location. Conducting board and board committee meetings with an anchor location that is physically accessible for members of the public to attend in person presents a substantial risk to the health and safety of those who may be present at the anchor location. This determination is based upon the following facts, among others. The COVID-19 pandemic is ongoing, and significant and continued community person-to-person transmission of the SARS-CoV coronavirus 2 virus continues to occur in the state of Utah, and federal, state, and local health authorities have adopted guidelines for the general public and businesses which encourage institutions and individuals to take precautions, including limiting in-person interactions and recommending increased virtual interactions. This written determination takes effect on August 24th, 2020, and is effective until midnight on September 23rd, 2020, no more than 30 days after the effective date of this declaration, and may be reissued by future written determinations of the board of the chair of the board, at that or any other appropriate time, dated this 21st day of August, 2020, signed Carlton J. Christensen, Chair of the Board of Trustees.
Thank you, Jana. We would also note that any public comment previously received prior to this meeting has been distributed to the board since we're taking no in-person comment. However, we solicit any additional comments or concerns through our normal communications channels and welcome any comments the public or others may want to share with us. With that, let us move on to our Safety First Minute, and we welcome Sheldon Shaw with us this morning. Good morning, Sheldon.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. Good morning, trustees. As always, thanks for the opportunity to give a Safety First Minute. This morning, I want to look to the Centers for Disease Control, and they've done great work in education and pushing out best practices to help keep us all safe. But that's not the only thing they're working on. The initiative for this month, this September, is National Food Safety Education Month. And the reason that's important is 1 in 6 Americans each year get sick from contaminated food. 3,000 of us die each year from contaminated food. And so they offer some simple guidelines in order to help keep us safe. Those are clean, separate, cook, and chill. As we're preparing our food, make sure we wash our hands, utensils, and surfaces. We should separate some foods. Raw meat, poultry, seafood, and eggs can spread germs, so we should separate them from cooked and fresh produce. When we cook our food, we need to make sure we use internal temperature. For instance, chicken should be cooked to 165 degrees and salmon should be cooked to 140 degrees. And finally, we should chill our leftovers, make sure they get in the fridge and not sit out. Chair, appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Sheldon. Great reminder as we go into our holiday weekend. Our next item up is our consent agenda, and we have minutes from a prior board meeting as well as 2 additional special board meetings. I'll look to my colleagues for a motion.
Mr. Chair, I'll make a motion that we approve the consent agenda.
I'll second that.
I have a motion from Beth, seconded by Kent. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. Thank you. With We'll move to item number 4, which is our agency report, and we'll turn to our Executive Director, Carolyn Goodnot. Good morning, Carolyn.
Good morning. Just a couple things. One is the ridership report, but first I just wanted to let you know that we've been working on one of our transit-oriented development projects that recently UTA and Hamilton Partners broke ground on an $85 million phase of the East Village TOD at the Sandy Civic Center track station. This is the 5th of 7 development phases, includes 305 residential units mixed with ground floor retail. And the apartments will share a parking garage with UTA's park and ride facility, which is being constructed simultaneously. UTA's parking is partially funded by a Surface Transportation Program grant, or STP grant, and the construction on the garage is anticipated to be completed in spring 2021, and the apartments will start to be available in the fall. So just wanted to give you that little bit of news on one of our TOD projects moving forward. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about, have Eddie Cummins, our Chief Operating Officer, talk about the ridership report. We did go into a restoration of some of our service on August 23rd. And so we just wanted to give you sort of the first week of numbers and answer any questions that you might have. So I'm going to turn it over to Eddie.
Good morning, Eddie.
Good morning. Can we go to the next slide, please? So I just wanted to provide a quick update on ridership. As you know, we restored about 91% of our service on August change day. And as you can see on the chart, we saw a significant jump on our Monday ridership. It went down a little bit, throughout time, but we're doing really quite well. So right now today, bus is down 55%. And just to break that number down a little bit more, if we look at all of our bus business units, they're all seeing a very similar trend. Salt Lake bus is down 53%. Ogden was down 54%, and Temp was down 59%. So overall, they're all in that range. Currently, light rail's down 60%. UVX is still down 64%. Paratransit's down 64%, and Front Runner's down 74%. Overall, our weekday ridership is 64,267 on last Friday. And if you compare that to my last report, ridership's up 27.2% versus August 5th. So next slide, please. We saw a similar trend on Saturday. Saturday ridership is 42,302, and that was up 25.6% versus my last report on August 5th. Next slide, please. This is a slide that I showed last time that just kind of puts into perspective where we're at and what the recovery looks like. As you can see, if you look at the current versus our pre-COVID ridership, we're down significantly. But if you compare current ridership to April 7th, which was our low, we're up quite significant. So fixed route bus is up 68%, commuter rail is up 102%, light rail is up 59%, paratransit's up 213%, our microtransit's up 93%. And overall, system-wide, since August 7th, when compared to August 7th, we're up 68%. Next slide, please. And that concludes the ridership report for today. Are there any questions?
Eddie, those are encouraging numbers. Certainly, we know that as some of the schools come on board, have you had any, obviously we were running a lot of that service beforehand, but have there been any issues come up as you've brought that service back online and sort of got back into that rhythm again on that higher service level?
No, August change day was very smooth. It went very well. It was well planned, and things have gone relatively well. We're continuing to do what we were doing during the COVID timeframe, or during that time between April and August. We're still monitoring ridership on a daily basis, and taking a look at routes level ridership, seeing what's happening, trying to maintain that 20 people per bus. We do have a couple of trips that have exceeded that amount, but there's yet to be a pattern. So we've had, short spells of time where we've had more than 20 people on a bus, but it's not consistent. It's not that we can nail it down and say, okay, this trip needs additional help. Those times have kind of jumped around a little bit. So we're continuing to watch, and we're going to watch and see how trends develop, and then we'll respond to that.
Okay, excellent. Any other questions for Eddie? Not seeing any. Carolyn, we'll come back to you.
Yeah, so that concludes my report for this week. Rather short. Thanks.
Yeah, no, that's great. Some very encouraging news. Thank you to both of you. With that, we'll move to number 5 with our financial report for July of 2020, and we'll go to Troy Bingham, who's our acting CFO, and as well as Brad Armstrong, who's our #1 numbers guy. So welcome both of you, Troy and Brad.
Members of the board. Again, my name is Troy Bingham. I'm the acting CFO. I do have Brad Armstrong here to present the slides to you. I'm here to answer any questions you have about the monthly financials that were available in your packet. So I'll turn the time over to Brad and let him do his part.
Good morning. My name is Brad Armstrong. I'm the Senior Manager of Budget and Financial Analysis for UTA. What we want to talk about this morning is the year-to-date financial results for UTA at a high level in the UTA Board dashboard. And then in the following slides, we'll be talking about a little bit more detail with regard to revenues and also expenses versus our budget. So in the UTA Board dashboard, some of the highlights in this document is the first one is sales taxes. Sales taxes through the month of June came in very strongly. For the month of June, we came in 2.7% above budget, and year to date, we're about slightly above budget at 0.4% above budget. And this has surprised us to a certain extent because of the economic turmoil associated with the COVID crisis. And one of the things that we've noticed is that why is this happening? And a lot of it has to do with the fact that Utah has a very vibrant economy right now. In fact, we have the lowest unemployment rate in the country. And add to that the federal stimulus that has taken place, and sales have been very strong and provided us revenue. How that will go in the future is a little bit of an unknown, as there's still a lot of unknown in the economic situation. If we look down at the bottom of the graph, we can see what's been happening with sales taxes. As we can see, the red line in that graph, we can see that's a 6-month moving average of sales tax growth. We've seen that peaked out in February, and then it's fallen off. But it's still very strong because it's about at our long-range growth rate of 5%, which we see. Going onwards, on the other side, on fair revenue, we saw fair revenue in the month of July drop by about 45%, which we expect because if we look down below that at ridership, we see ridership is down about 59%. And some people might ask, well, why is fair revenue still a little bit better than our ridership? And that's partially because we have fixed contracts for fares that we get paid a certain amount per month. And so they don't merge, but over time they will. Other things that have happened here is our operating expenses are below budget by about 7% for the month and 8.5% for the year. And we'll talk about that in later slides. Any questions on the dashboard? If not, next slide, please. One of the things that we've seen is, as I mentioned, is our passenger revenue, fare box revenue, is below where we budgeted for the year because of the change in ridership. And we can see in the red bar, this is cumulative over time. On the far right, we have about a $10.1 million below budget revenue for fare box. And we've taken steps to deal with this issue, and we'll talk about that a little bit going forward. Next slide, please. On the sales tax side, we've seen very vibrant sales tax growth over the last 12 months. This is a 12-month percentage growth year over year, and we can see by county. And on the left side, we can see the green bar, which is Salt Lake County, which accounts for about 60% of our total sales tax revenue. It's been growing at 2.8% during that time period. But then the other counties, which make up our service area, have had very vibrant sales tax growth over the last 12 months. Utah County is about 19% of our sales tax revenue. They're growing 12%. And then Davis and Weber County are over 8%, which has been very helpful to our sales tax revenue. Next slide, please. So for sales tax revenues through June of this year, you can see on the right side, on a cumulative basis, we're about even with where we thought we would be on a budget to actual basis, which is very helpful for us in terms of sustaining service during this time. Next slide, please. And one of the things that's been helpful is we have received federal CARES Act subsidies. And so the red bars, as you might remember from prior slides, on the far right, we've had about a $10 million loss in farebox revenue, but we have received about $50 million so far in CARES Act funding to help cover up that deficit. Next slide, please. Going on, just to discuss what's happening with regard to UTA's efforts to control our costs versus budget, you can see that for the most part, year to date, we're about $15 million below budget in terms of our expenses for the years. And these are sort of the components that explain where we are versus our budget. The biggest expense that we've saved in terms of a category would be in our administrative expense. We've been able to cut back on our contract services costs by about half of that, $4.66 million, both in IT and in terms of contracted services for our paratransit services, as we've offered less there, and in our via microtransit services, as we've used less of that service because of the reduced service operations. Going down at the bottom, we can see on the bus side, we have $3.41 million on the bottom green bar. We're $3.41 million below budget, and about $3 million of that is due to using less fuel at a lower cost. A similar story can be said for what's happened with commuter rail, as most of that $2.6 million positive variance versus our budget is due to reduced use of fuel as we've had reduced service miles. Next slide, please. Looking at it a little bit different way, we can see on the operating, we can see the various items by the chief officers of the organization. We can see that by far the largest amount is on our operating side, as we've reduced service, and if we've looked at reducing our costs, we've seen about a $9 million drop in that area, of which about half of that is fuel savings. Other parts has been reduced labor, as we've been able to manage our labor costs down as we've been able to run less service. The other big changes in our executive director area, as we've had reduced use of contract services in our IT area, and have not had to use our contingencies that we had in place. Next slide. Finally, we have by cost category, we see these things. We see that we saved about $5.8 million in terms of fuel so far through the year. Reduced services, which is that contract service items I mentioned, both for our microtransit, our IT services, and other areas. We've had reduced wages because we've not had to have as much labor because of our reduced services. And overall, what we've been able to do as an organization is react quickly to this COVID event and manage our expenses through these challenging times. I would open up for any questions you might have.
Brad, I have a question. I just wanted to clarify, make sure I understand. When you talk about the wages and benefits being reduced labor, it's really because we are not doing overtime as nearly as much as we did prior to the pandemic. Isn't that correct?
That's certainly one of the portions of why we're below budget for wages and benefits. We also have not hired as many people as we did before. We didn't need to train as many people as we did before, as we have not needed as much labor going forward.
Yeah, I just wanted to, clarify that. So thank you.
Thanks. Other questions from the board? I'm not seeing any. Brad, thank you very much. And Troy, I assume that concludes your financial report.
That concludes my report.
Okay. Thank you. That's encouraging news. We know we're certainly not out of the woods yet, but that certainly puts us in a better position than we might be otherwise. We'll move on to item number 6, which is resolutions. And the first item up is a resolution amending the terms and conditions of employment for Executive Director Carolyn Gannott. I will just give just a brief background in our employment contract that we approved last June that was effective of April 19th of 2019. It had some options there, including annual goals and review, and the board has taken that action, and these amendments are reflective of that evaluation and also options within that employment contract. So unless there's other discussion or questions, I would entertain a motion on this resolution.
Mr. Chair, I move that we approve the amended terms and conditions for the employment contract for the executive director.
Second.
I have a motion from Kent, seconded by Beth. I'll ask for a roll call.
Trustee Millington,
Aye.
Trustee Holbrook,
Aye.
Chair Christensen.
Aye.
The vote is unanimous. Thank you.
Right. And our thanks to Carolyn. And she just had her 1-year anniversary, and we've very much appreciated the opportunity to work with her and for her leadership here in this agency. Let's go to resolution R2020-09-02, which is a resolution approving the execution of an interlocal cooperation agreement with Park City to cooperate on the procurement, purchase, and operation and maintenance of electric buses and charging infrastructure using funds awarded through the Federal Transit Administration 2018 Low-No Grant Program. And with that, we'll turn to Mary Diloreto. Good morning, Mary.
Good morning. Yes, so this resolution authorizes the execution of the interlocal cooperation agreement with Park City Transit Municipal Corporation regarding electric bus and charging infrastructure. I do have Tracy Young here as well. She is one of our grants administrators, so she can help answer any questions you may have when I'm done. Can I have the next slide, please? So the project overview. In the fiscal year 2018 Low-No grant, FTA awarded Park City some funds through that, $2.29 million for that work. And Park City intends to use those funds to purchase 2 electric buses and the associated charging infrastructure to be used on the Park City Salt Lake City Connect route that UTA operates. And because UDOT manages the grant process for federal funds for all the rural areas of this state, they would like us to have an interlocal agreement with Park City to show how we will use those federal funds. So right now we are preparing a solicitation to purchase 20 electric buses as part of the Volkswagen settlement agreement. And Park City would like to add the 2 buses that they want to buy through this Low-No grant award to that solicitation. And they also have another 12 electric buses that they would like to purchase separately. And they would like to add that to our procurement as well to reduce duplication of effort. Okay, the next slide. And this just shows the Park City Connect route. I think you're all familiar with it. And like I said, those 2 new buses would be used on this route. Can I have the next slide? So as I mentioned, the grant award was for $2.29 million. Rocky Mountain Power has committed another $500,000 towards the project for the cost of infrastructure improvements. And then UTA will fund the rest of the local match for the bus purchase at about $443,000, we estimate. And these funds are going to come from the vehicle replacement fund that we've set up in the UTA Park City agreement for that PC Connect service. As part of that service, they reimburse us per mile, and we set aside a portion of that for those replacement buses as they come due. And then for those additional 12 vehicles that Park City would like to purchase, all that funding is coming from Park City themselves. Next slide, please. So the interlocal cooperation agreement specifies how we will use those funds. So all activities associated with the grant, including procurement of those 2 electric buses, 1 overhead charger, which we actually have already, we had pre-award authority, so we have already constructed that here at our central station. Depot charging equipment that will be put into the depot district when it's finished, and then retrofit of 1 overhead charger up at Park City. And then it also discusses a collaboration on the procurement of the 12 additional buses for Park City. And then it talks about the use and maintenance commitments for the grant-funded charging infrastructure, as well as the buses associated with the PC Connect service. And I think that's all I had. Any questions on that?
Mary, a couple of questions. I'm assuming for Park City, there's probably a pricing advantage to being part of our procurement. In addition, I assume that there's probably an advantage to us to packaging that together as well.
Yeah, I think the having a larger quantity that we're going after will help us with the price, I would assume, as well. Yes.
And then I just wondered, is there something in our, and I assume any of the operating costs are covered in that agreement with Park City on the Park City Connect, like for the electric charging and those kind of things?
Yes, all those commitments. And if Tracy maybe could add a little bit on that. Tracy, are you available? I can't hear you, Tracy, so I don't know if you're talking.
She was trying there, but it's not quite connecting somehow.
I think your volume isn't working, Tracy, but yeah, we have all the details for the operations and maintenance spelled out in the PC Connect agreement with Park City.
Okay.
Sorry, we can't hear you, Tracy.
That's all right. She always has great wisdom, so we're missing out on that.
And her great accent, we're missing too.
Yeah. The other piece I wondered is, does Park City cover any of our costs on the procurement? Albeit, I would think it's relatively small, but there's probably some administrative overhead associated with that. And I wondered, does any of that get covered?
We have not asked them to cover that administrative cost, but we are doing it all. They will be part of the selection committee as well for that. But no, we haven't asked them to contribute on that administrative cost. We are purchasing, 20 for ourselves, and we have committed to buy replacement buses. So 2 of those buses we're buying are replacement for the PC Connect service.
Okay.
I see Hal Johnson is on as well. And maybe Hal, can you add anything about the maintenance agreement?
I was just to Carlton's question, we do have some funding allocated within the grant for UTA time.
Okay.
So we did allocate some grant funds for that. It's not necessarily directly for that item, but we do have funds for UTA staff time in the grant.
Okay. That's great. Other questions? Beth, it looked like you might have one.
I did. I just had a quick question in terms of, I recognize that UDOT has that requirement for the rural areas to do an interlocal. But I also noticed in the contract that they have a form that they utilize for the just like the vehicle surveillance inspections. Is UDOT kind of in effect involved in this as well, or is this simply just an interlocal between Park City and UTA, which is what it looks like to me? I just wanted to kind of ask that question.
It's just between UTA and Park City, but it's at the request of UDOT, so they're, so they can feel comfortable that these funds are being expended the way they're intended to be.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions for Mary or staff? Okay. Seeing none, I would entertain a motion on this particular resolution.
Mr. Chair, I'd like to make a motion that we approve R 2020-09-02, the resolution approving the execution of an interlocal agreement with Park City to cooperate on procurement, purchase, operation, and maintenance of electric buses and charging infrastructure using funds through the Federal Transit Administration on a low-no grant program.
Second.
I have a motion from Beth, seconded by Kent. I'll ask for a roll call.
Trustee Millington,
Aye.
Trustee Holbrook,
Aye.
Chair Christensen.
Aye.
The vote is unanimous. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. And thank you, Mary. We're up now to item 7 on our agenda, which is contracts, disbursements, and grants. And the first item up is a contract in regards to our rail ticket vending machine, or TVM, system for their maintenance and support with Scheidt & Bachmann. With that, I'll turn to Dan Harmouth. Good morning, Dan.
Good morning, Chairman. Good morning, trustees. Want to ask to approve and award the sole source contract in the amount of $220,412 to Scheidt & Bachmann for a 2-year maintenance contract renewal. This contract renewal is for annual system maintenance for our back office ticket vending machine system and software on our over 158 ticket vending machines. In May, the IT department contacted Scheidt & Bachmann and asked for COVID-19 cost concessions, and Scheidt & Bachmann responded with a 15% discount if UTA signed a 2-year contract extension, which this is what this represents. The 15% discount over 2 years represents a $38,896 savings to UTA. This 2-year contract will also allow UTA 2 years to research and possibly put an RFP out for replacement TVMs and the time for configuration and implementation if the FAIRS group decides to do this. The contract takes effect if signed on October 1st of 2020 and goes through September of 2022. I'm open to any questions.
Dan, I know, and because I remember in Scheidt & Bachmann does a lot of revenue control systems for parking equipment too, and not related necessarily to UTA, but so that's how I'm remembering the name. But a lot of the early TVMs were Scheidt & Bachmann. Are all of ours in our system Scheidt & Bachmann?
Yes, all of our TVMs are currently Scheidt & Bachmann right now.
Okay. So this really covers all of the TVMs that we currently have.
Yes, yes, it does.
Okay. Any questions, however, from Dan or for Dan? Okay. I'm not seeing any. With that, then I would entertain a motion from a member of the board.
I move that we approve this contract with Scheidt & Bachmann for the 2-year time period as explained.
Second.
I have a motion from Kent, seconded by Beth. All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any opposed? That motion passes. Thank you, Dan.
Thank you very much.
We'll move to item number B under contracts, and that is for board management software with Carashoft and Technology Corporation in Granicus. And with that, we'll turn to Lowell Bate and our very own Jana Osler. It's time to grill her, folks. Jana?
Thank you, Chair and trustees. As you are well aware, since the establishment of the new governance and this board of trustees, you all have opted to do board meetings on a rather more frequent basis than used to happen. And these board meetings require a significant amount of labor and lots of moving parts. And because of that, we have determined that we have a need for board management software that will help us to make this process more sustainable and more streamlined. Some of the functions that a board management tool or solution can help us with are the submission of agenda items for board and committee meetings, the review and approval of agenda-related documents, the compilation of meeting packets, and improve video streaming options, and also the publishing of meeting materials like documents, PowerPoints, audio files, etc., for greater transparency to the public. The board staff, as well as the executive director and IT staff, including Lowell Bate, who is on with me as the IT project manager, and various others in the agency have done some extensive research to find an adequate tool to help us with this process. In this review, we have researched other software programs and approaches, and after a review have found a tool called Legistar, which is a Granicus product, and that has been selected as a tool to help with the board process. Legistar or Granicus is it's the most used tool for this kind of technology in the country, and it's really the best option for us. Carasoft Technology Corporation is a reseller for Granicus, and it is part of the NASPO Utah State contract. So this procurement was effected through the state contract. So staff proposes approving a 5-year contract for the Granicus tool Legistar, which includes installation and setup fees and an annual license maintenance fee, which increases annually. The total 5-year contract value for this software solution is $236,004.97. So we would propose an approval of this contract so that we can make our board management system more efficient.
Thank you, Jana. I imagine one of the reasons why this is on the state contract is that other large public agencies in the state are currently using it, right? We're not the first one in the state to enter this arena with this particular solution.
Definitely not. There are other large agencies in the state that use this software.
Okay. Any questions from the board?
Jana, I noticed that I know there's been some discussion, and I just wanted to kind of have you maybe comment on this or clarify. The advantage to this software is that it will be able to be integrated with our Laserfiche program as well. Is that correct?
That's correct. There is some Laserfiche integration capability. And as we get into implementation, we'll have a little bit better idea of how that will work and how we can streamline those two processes merging together.
Thank you.
Jana, how long do you anticipate it will take to implement and be able to use this software program?
The staff at Granicus have told us that we should expect about a 6-month implementation process. We would hope that it can go as quickly as possible, but they have cautioned that if we try to speed it up too much, then it can cause problems, but we will do the best we can to move it forward as quickly as possible.
All right, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Good. Any other questions for Jana or Lowell? Jana, not.
I make a motion that we approve the contract as presented for the Granicus software.
Okay.
I'll second.
Have a motion by Kent, seconded by Beth. Any other discussion? I will note, Jana, you passed your test there on making your pitch. So, all in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Any opposed? That motion passes. Thank you. We'll look forward to that implementation.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
That brings us now to item C, which is a change order for positive train control, or PTC for mandatory directive speed upgrades for the Ogden cab signal speed upgrades and PDC on-call support. And so with that, we'll turn to Eddie Cummings and Dave Hancock. Good morning, gentlemen.
Good morning. I will turn this one over to Dave. He'll be presenting this contract.
Thank you, Eddie and trustees. We are asking for approval to execute a change order to Rocky Mountain Systems Services, or RMSS, in the amount of $3,422,403, making the new contract value $33,507,678. This change order has 3 parts. The first part is the mandatory directive early release function, which is approximately $2.9 million of the change order. And then the second part is Ogden North speed upgrades, which is $184,000. And then the PTC support staff, which is $343,000. The mandatory directive early release functionality will help mitigate delays that were introduced into the system due to PTC implementation. Back in December 2018 is when we started in Front Runner North. A mandatory directive is a speed restriction that is enforced. It's usually a 0 speed or a 15-mile-per-hour speed when we have an issue at a grade crossing. The most common issues at grade crossings are from traffic accidents that damage the gates or some malfunction of the gate due to weather or just any other anomaly that we see in the system. This change order will allow the train to receive a speed upgrade as soon as they pass the effective grade crossing. This saves delay time as the train is going faster for a longer period. The second part of the change order is for the Ogden North speed upgrades. This is changing the cab speed from 15 miles an hour to 30 miles an hour into and out of the station. Obviously, they won't be going that fast into the station, but it allows them to have a higher speed for a longer period of time. And this will not only help schedule and timing, but it will also help the operators with the ease of operating the train. They don't have to just keep it right at 15 miles an hour. It's a little bit easier to operate that way. And the third part of the change order is for contractor support staff to assist with reporting and troubleshooting PTC-related issues. This requirement is mandated by the FRA for all PTC railroads, and this reporting includes closing out every anomaly associated with the PTC system on a monthly basis. Are there any questions about this change order?
Dave, I can only imagine you wouldn't want to introduce another vendor into these upgrades at this point, now that you're going. But did the original contract, I guess, foresee or have allowance for this type of a change order within its context?
You know, it did have allowances for change orders. We anticipated that after running the PTC system through revenue service demonstration, we were hoping to be able to figure out items such as this mandatory directive to be able to help with the delays that we knew were going to be introduced into the system during the PTC implementation.
Okay. Helpful, thank you. Any other questions from the board?
David, I had a question. How many, I think that I understand that there are like 55 crossings or so that are positively impacted by this change that would, with PTC. How many grade crossings are there total? Do you know? And I'm wondering, are there 55 just throughout the entire, in almost every city that we're in?
Yeah, that is in Front Runner. There's around 55, and then obviously tracks, we have double that. We don't have PTC on tracks, but I do have some stats. Since December 2018, we've had over 575 mandatory directives at grade crossings place. And going back and looking at this information, this upgrade will help in 85 to 90% of those situations. We will be given a higher speed. So
wow, that's
that will be a big improvement.
Yeah. Thank you.
Any other questions? Okay. If there are none, I would entertain a motion on this change order.
Mr. Chair, I'll make a motion that we approve the change order for the PTC positive train control, the mandatory directive speed upgrades, Ogden cab signal speed upgrades, and PTC on-call support with Rocky Mountain Systems Services.
Second?
Have a motion by Beth, seconded by Kent. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? That motion passes. Thanks, Dave, and thanks, Eddie. With that, we'll go to our pre-procurements and turn to Todd Mills for that update. Todd, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair. This morning we have 3 items that are ready to go out for procurement. The first item is outsourcing of the ticket vending machine, or TVM, maintenance. This is a procurement contract with a firm to conduct the maintenance and repairs of UTA's TVMs. This will be a 3-year contract with 2 one-year options. The contracted employees will report to our TVM asset manager, and he will oversee their daily work duties. This contract has been approved in the budget plan for the term of the contract. This procurement will be conducted as an RFP with technical criteria evaluated in addition to price. And I do have Brian Richardson on there. He is the TVM asset manager to assist with any questions you might have.
Maybe I have one question for Brian, if he's available. And Brian, why would we contract the work out as opposed to do the service work ourselves? Is it less expensive or more efficient? Or?
Hi, thank you for the question. Right now, we're sharing employees with MOW, and so this will give us an opportunity to have dedicated employees to work just on ticket vending machines.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions on that one? Okay, Todd, should we go? Oh, go ahead, Kent.
Just this question. We've already passed some additional funding for the ticket vending machines software, I believe. How does that play into this particular maintenance contract, or does it?
This is a separate contract. This is just for the maintenance, the physical maintenance, whereas the other one is for software.
For the software. Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Good question. Any others? All right, Todd, should we go to the next item?
Yeah, the next one we have is purchasing card, or P-card service. So this is a procurement contract with a firm to provide commercial credit cards, also known as P-cards, to the agency. For the UTA policies and spending authority, these cards will be used to pay for goods and services under $5,000 to merchants who accept credit cards. P-cards help us to reduce administrative costs to the agency by eliminating requisitions, purchase orders, and accounts payable payments on lower dollar items. UTA does not pay the financial firm for this service, but rather the firm receives a percentage of the transaction fee as their payment for services. This procurement will be conducted as an RFP where technical criteria will be evaluated in addition to price. And do you have any questions on this one?
I only have one, Todd. I know that occasionally, like, the state will have a contract for, a similar way. Do we generally find it's more to our advantage to go out on our own or look at the state contract, or does this process evaluate either option?
This process would evaluate either option. So we would have that those bids to compare against the state contract. But generally, we actually do almost better all the time on contracting our own stuff. And I think it's typically because we can usually give more firm dollar amounts to the suppliers, so they're willing to give a little better price.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions, though? All right. Next item, Todd.
Yeah, the last one we have is Public Relations and Marketing Agency. So this is a procurement contract with a firm to provide advertising services for UTA. The contracted firm will support the agency in our paid branding, advertising, and marketing campaigns. The Communications and Marketing Office is requesting a base contract term of 5 years plus 3 option years. This term is beyond the Utah Procurement Code standard term of 5 years. However, it is allowable if it is approved by the Chief Procurement Officer and is in the best interest of the agency. The Chief Procurement Officer has approved the total contract term of 8 years based on the nature, complexity, and longevity of marketing campaigns and advertising strategies. The option to continue the contract beyond 5 years will allow UTA the flexibility to continue the contract should it be in the best interest of the agency at the time. This will be conducted as an RFP where technical criteria will be evaluated in addition to price. And I have Andrea Packer on here as well with us if you have any questions that she could answer.
Well, I guess I do. I am trying to understand what would potentially change between 8 years and 5 years, and it just seems like a long time.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, trustees. I'm happy to answer that. As Todd mentioned in the summary, a lot of our branding and marketing campaigns are things that are built over a long period of time. And in some cases, they will, well, most of our campaigns are planned to be within a calendar year. There have been occasions where efforts span over into the next year. So for example, last year, although some of our plans changed, we had begun work on some of our 50th anniversary celebrations as late as last year. And then as we were retooling some of our communication strategy in light of the new governance structure and leadership, we had a campaign that we designed and built to last for a couple of years. And so last year we did grant a 1-year extension to the current firm. So that's just an example of where sometimes that flexibility can be in the best interest of the agency when the time comes.
Any questions for Andrea?
No, not a question, just a comment. Structurally, communications don't always work on calendar years. And so I think that this ultimately does have benefit for the agency simply because as we noticed with COVID, where obviously that was an unanticipated challenge of communications in terms of what we were doing in order to, show how we were taking care of our operators and riders during this time. And that's something that sometimes needs to have longer than the calendar year, or overlaps. There are other issues. So I think this is a good strategy to have.
Any other questions then? All right. Thank you, Andrea. Todd, anything else?
Not today, Mr. Chair.
All right. Thank you. Thanks for that update. Well, next, go to a discussion item, and then we probably take a short break after this. But item 8A, which is our risk management insurance program update. And we'll invite Dave Pitcher along with Brian White with Alliant Insurance Services. Dave, good morning.
Good morning, Mr. Chair and trustees. I am here to provide an update in accordance with the board policy on risk management. Next slide. The board policy requires an update on the status of the authority's risk management program. Also, that the authority maintain a public errors and omissions insurance in an amount determined to be adequate to protect the authority, and also that the authority procure other insurance to compensate for losses that would adversely affect the authority. So I'm not, next slide, please. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the risk management program since it was presented to the board earlier this year. We entered into a contract with Crow to provide an enterprise risk management assessment and report on a framework for UTA. All phases of that contract have been completed, and a final report was presented to the board. So next slide. The authority will maintain a public errors and omissions insurance in an amount determined to be adequate to protect the authority. So we've renewed all of our insurance program, and I just want to touch briefly on the public errors and omissions coverage that was renewed September 1st. Last year, we lowered the limit on this coverage from from 5 million to 2 million. And the reason for doing that was because we have an excess umbrella policy that sits on top of this policy, and it affords coverage of $10 million. So we have a combined limit of $12 million. So we didn't need to maintain that primary $5 million limit, which saved us some money. So this was last year's program. If we go to the next slide, this is the updated program. It's still $2 million with a $100,000 retention. We also have an employment practices liability coverage associated with this policy, and there's $125,000 retention on the EPLI coverage. The premium has gone up on this to $73,092, and that's the current status on the public officials' errors and omissions.
Dave, tell me what EPL stands for.
Employment practices liability. So discrimination claims, those types of claims fall under that. Okay, next slide. So this is the third part of the risk management policy, and that's to procure other insurance to compensate for losses that would adversely affect the authority. We go through this renewal every year. All of those policies, well, I should say most of those policies renew on September 1st. And so we've gone through that renewal policy and renewed all of these coverages, and I just want to cover them and talk about some of the changes that have occurred this year during our renewal. So next slide, please. I mentioned the blanket excess policy. This diagram or illustration shows what that blanket excess liability policy sits on top of. And as you can see over on the right, the public officials, errors and omissions, and employment practices liability policy is shown there with the $2 million limit. This blanket excess policy sits on top of that with another $10 million. So the increase this year on the public officials E&O was up 12%. Overall on this blanket excess policy, it went up 1% this year. On the premium. You can see that for our self-insurance program on our bus operations, which we retain a $2 million self-insured retention, that's $1 million under what the occurrence cap is for the tort liability caps provided under the Governmental Immunity Act. So we do have $1 million coverage over and above that with this blanket excess liability policy. Same thing with the general liability, which we would use for those premises and operations that are that we don't carry insurance for. Then we also carry police professional liability coverage of $2 million. We have a $500,000 deductible on that policy. It's gone up a little over almost 7% increase. And then we have premises liability, which we have that policy because of a contract we have with the LDS Church to make use of their some of their parking lots at various chapels throughout our service area to use as park and ride lots. And the LDS Church requires us to carry a liability policy in which they're named as an additional insured, and this is the policy that we carry. We have added a few other properties to that premises liability when we've entered into contracts on leases and things like that. But for the most part, it covers those park and ride lots. And as you can see, that's one of the few premiums that's gone down this year. If we could have the next slide, please. So this was the big increase, and we've had a few changes to this coverage. This is for our rail liability. And again, this is another policy that we carry because of a contract with Union Pacific. We're required to carry a $100 million liability policy on which Union Pacific is named as an additional insured. It increased quite significantly this year, and I have Brian White with me, who is the team leader for Alliant Insurance Services, which is our insurance brokerage. And I've asked him to kind of explain what is happening in the market and talk a little bit about why some of these premiums are going up so much. So I'll turn a little bit of time over to Brian if you would like to address that.
Is Brian there?
Brian, you're on mute still, looks like.
Hello, this is Brian. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Okay. All right. Thanks so much, David, and board for the opportunity to discuss the marketplace with you this morning. Just briefly, a little bit about Alliant. We are one of the top 10 largest insurance brokers in the U.S. A couple of things that make us unique. First of all, we're private. In fact, 1 in 3 employees is a shareholder, and we create operating groups within the company based on specialty. So I happen to be in the public sector group and am one of the transit practice leaders, and we have transit properties and operations throughout the Western U.S., similar to UTA. And the thinking and the logic behind that is, we can deliver expertise to the client based on our historical relevant history working with other like-kind operations. So with that being said, David mentioned the marketplace, and unfortunately, for the last 20 months or so, the market has been in a period of hardening. And that means that pricing has been going up. And this has really been sort of uncharacteristic of the marketplace. Going back to maybe 2001, after September 11th, was the last time we really saw the market harden. And between then and about 20 months ago, we were in a sustained market where there was, plentiful capacity, there was healthy competition, so on and so forth, except for some spikes around Katrina, Rita, and William, if you recall those hurricanes, Superstorm Sandy, and some other events. The market quickly sort of got on its feet after those and got back into this groove of being very competitive. So unfortunately, those days are behind us. And there are different issues impacting different segments of the market. I'll talk briefly about the property market because part of your portfolio is property insurance too. 2017 was the largest catastrophe year on record for insured losses within the industry. And then turn around to 2018, that was the 3rd highest loss year on record. So 2017 was a series of hurricanes in the south and the southeast. 2018 were the fires, if you recall, in California that drove lots of those losses. And then there's been an accumulation of large attritional type losses. And so that's sort of caused a change in the appetite in the marketplace and a loss of capacity in insurers willing to write the risk. More on that a little bit later. But turning the page to the liability market, which David is speaking to here specifically about railroad liability, there are other sets of issues that have been driving this particular market to harden. And thankfully, in Utah specifically, and a handful of other states in the U.S., you have some very helpful tort protections available for the public sector. And so you're insulated to a certain degree from what some of our clients in California or Washington, for example, are experiencing, but cannot totally escape it, unfortunately, the way the market works. But to give you an example of what's driving this in the liability side is there's been a significant increase in loss severity, that is the dollar value of liability losses over the last 5 to 7 years and maybe even more. And one exhibit we look at and we share with our clients is the medium average top 50 U.S. verdicts between 2014 and 2018 has actually doubled. So there's been these significant increases in losses paid by insurers, and so they're looking at their book and their performance, and they're saying, "Gosh, we haven't priced this correctly because the losses are turning out to be much higher than we thought they would be." So a little bit more on the liability market. Yesterday, I viewed a presentation to APTA's committee for rail CEOs, and one of the things that they talked about was the insurance market, because this is an issue that's impacting all transit properties across the country. A couple of takeaways I got from that is the average 3-year increase over the last 3 years has been 60% on the railroad liability. That compares actually with UTA last year with a reduction, believe it or not, because we were able to bring some new capacity and do some creative things to reduce your costs, which was a rarity. But this year we were not able to sidestep the market, so you can see you're up 20-25%. The other big takeaway here that was really sort of, made the bigger point was there was a London broker on the phone, and he was speaking to, some of the limits that the Class 1 railroads purchase, and they historically have bought to the market. So purchasing upwards of $1.5 billion, $1.5 billion in limits for, think about these catastrophic type losses that could happen, oil trains, so on and so forth. The maximum amount of insurance they're able to get more recently has been $850 million, and that's really at any price. So the market itself has lost $650 million in capacity, and UTA's on its own program lost capacity this year. Swiss Re decided they no longer wanted to do railroad liability business, and Zurich completely left the marketplace. So we were left having to replace $35 million of your $100 million tower, and it's almost as simple as supply and demand. We have less insurers out there willing to write the risk, and so the cost of that insurance it becomes higher. I think that some good things, benefits to UTA again were the tort environment, and also the fact that your contract with Union Pacific requires $100 million in limits instead of what's more common we see out there is $295 million, because that's a federal tort cap on commuter rail accidents to injuries for passengers. And if you had to buy $295 million, I think it's safe to say we would have seen a higher increase in that 24% because some of those higher layers are getting impacted more by this more difficult market. Switching back to the property side, two large players, AIG and FM Global, have completely underwritten their books. They call this sort of deleveraging, and they've reduced their participation on risk in some cases by up to 50%. So again, this supply issue is very problematic. So I'm happy to answer any questions that the board may have if I can. Hopefully that gave you some ideas in terms of what's out there driving this marketplace. And so, happy to take those or we can move on, of course.
Brian, do you, obviously you don't have a crystal ball, but do you see that leveling out, or is this a kind of a downward spiral, if you will, for rail entities?
Yeah, and that's an excellent question. That's a great question. It's as you can imagine, it's very difficult to say, what the future market will bring. I think it's safe to say that until such time new capacity comes into the market, so new underwriters decide that, they've got the financial backing they need through, the channels that they would, equity raising, that sort of thing, to put into the market to take up and absorb some of that risk, we're probably going to be in this more difficult environment. I think the speculation is through 2021. After September 11th, a lot of the insurers and marketplaces in Bermuda were formed, and that was relief to the market because that brought new capacity. We haven't seen that yet. We haven't seen that new capacity, but we imagine somewhere in some room, people, are thinking about, okay, well, how do we deliver this capacity to the market and create a business out of this? So I do think that the property side will hopefully stabilize sooner than the liability side. Property tends to be a shorter life on claims because, you just think about it. If a house burns down, you rebuild it and you can be up and running in a year and things move on. On the liability side, you can be in litigation. If you think about the scale of litigation in the U.S. for 5, some claims 10 years and more. So I think there's just fundamentally some differences there that the market's going to have to reconcile, and that's going to take longer there.
Thank you. Any questions for Brian?
Not a question necessarily. I just, it's interesting to me because, of course, I'm thinking of all of these different rail carriers throughout the U.S., but then you look at this more on a global spectrum, and you're not even finding that global market to capacity at this stage. And I kind of a rhetorical question, I guess, if you will. Do you, when you're looking at the types, whether it's property or the liability, are you constantly looking at the market shifts and how that works? I'm just curious how that whole aspect functions.
Yeah, absolutely. And it just sort of amazes me that they never really talked about insurance when I was in college because there are so many different facets of the business. But, we're constantly talking with underwriters, brokers, wholesalers, MGAs. These are companies that have the authority on behalf of insurance underwriters to write business, to kind of keep our finger on the pulse of what's happening depending on the specific submarket, auto liability versus property versus general liability. And, we collectively take that information and then build strategies for our clients around, where there might be opportunities to improve based on what one particular market is doing and kind of how their view of risk differs from someone else's. And one of the things historically we've done is when the U.S. market's been hard, we've been able to go over to London, to Lloyd's, and do more business over there because they see that as an opportunity, or vice versa. In this case, it's been very difficult, and this is perhaps a sign of a true hard market, is both of those marketplaces are sort of seeing the market in the same view. So there's not sort of that arbitrage, unfortunately, but where things are changing, things do change. I think one of the things we will see is this pendulum swing back at some point. But again, the question remains sort of when that will be.
Before we move on to the next slide, I just want to mention something, and that is that last year, which was our first year with Alliant, they had the foresight to see what was coming with Zurich, and we changed our primary carrier from Zurich to Gemini. And, in hindsight, that was a great move because if we had to replace an incumbent carrier in this market, we would have seen a lot higher increase in our premium this year. Fortunately, Gemini became our incumbent carrier, so renewing with them, we didn't see as big an increase. So I'm really happy with what Alliant did for us last year, and I think it carried over to some savings for us this year in our rail liability. Next slide. So we also saw increases, but most of this on the work comp side was a result of increase in our payroll. So it was up 5%. We've actually kind of seen an average of 5% increase with our excess work comp and employment liability coverage. So it's kind of what we had planned for every year, and we did see that increase. Next slide, please. So as Brian mentioned, the about the property increases. Last year, we saw a really significant increase. Affiliated was our incumbent carrier, and they initially notified us that they were not going to renew coverage with us. In the end, I think they made a bit of an attempt to try and get us back, but we moved over to the Utah Local Government's Trust, and they seem to have more stable premiums over the long term. But in talking with them, they told me that this is the first year in 20 years they've seen a significant increase in property. And Brian's kind of explained that a little bit, but with the trust, since it's all local governments, you know, they haven't seen any significant losses. So most of this increase is coming from their reinsurer. They purchase reinsurance, and they're reinsurer because they're insuring other trusts and other insurance carriers. They had an increase, and the trust had to pass those increases along to all of their partners in the trust. So we saw a a little over 15.5% increase in that. Fortunately, we still have better coverage than we had previously. So, but we did see an increase there. Our cyber liability went up a little bit. We did change carriers with the cyber liability coverage. We still have the $3 million insurance on that with a $25,000 deductible. Next slide. So the van pool coverage was difficult to renew this year. The incumbent carrier, Liberty, decided that they would not renew with us. And so we had to go out and find insurance for this. It was very tough to find insurance that covered the van pool rideshare program the same way that it had been covered in the past. We had a variety of options, including self-insuring this program, but it would have meant some significant changes to the program, including reworking of the lease agreement on the rideshare program and re-signing all the leases with rideshare clients. We've been working closely with Cheryl and Eddie and Michael Goldman in the rideshare program to try and figure out how best to handle this. Fortunately for us, Alliant was able to find a carrier that was willing to insure the program the same way that it had been insured in the past, with $4 million insurance that covers to first dollar. There are no deductibles or self-insured retentions on this program, but there was a significant change in the premium. We've been discussing how this program needs to change in the future, and this bought us another 12 months to review the rideshare program and figure out how best to finance that risk in the future. We also carry a railroad protective liability policy. This slide shows no change, but there actually was a significant change to the rates on this. And just to kind of explain this program real quickly, we purchased this blanket policy in order to protect UTA from contractors that are coming onto our right-of-way. A railroad protective liability policy is a policy that contractors have to purchase that is basically a policy owned by UTA. It insures us as the named insured on that policy. The problem with this coverage is that it's fairly expensive, and when small contractors come onto our right-of-way, it's tough for them to afford to be able to purchase this program. So we looked at what Union Pacific was doing. Union Pacific purchases a blanket policy, and then they enroll contractors in that under that policy, and they can charge them a lot less to enroll them under a policy like that. So I think it was about $7 years ago, 7 or 8 years ago, that we purchased a blanket policy like that. The initial premium that we pay on that is made up by contractors enrolling in the program, and contractors pay us to enroll in that program, and as a result of that, we're able to cover that premium without any cost to UTA. So the minimum premium actually went up this year because we changed carriers. It went up to $20,000, but we shouldn't have any problem covering that minimum premium with the number of contractors that enroll in this program. We were able to keep the rate down to what it was last year. The incumbent carrier was going to double the rate, so we went out to the market and found a new carrier that would maintain those rates that we've had in the past. So I just wanted to mention that, and that's administered by my department, but it's the property group that handles those contractors coming into the right-of-way. Next slide. So these are our financial coverages. The fiduciary liability, which covers the retirement plan, those that administer the retirement plan. It went up slightly this year. And then the crime policy is a new policy that we purchased last year. And it actually carries through this renewal period and renews on July 1st, but I just wanted to show it here, and so that you'd be aware that we do have this policy. It's 10 million in limits, and we were also able to replace the treasurer's bond that we're required to carry by statute. So we were able to not have to carry that bond since the treasurer is covered under this policy as well. Next slide, please. And then we carry an ERISA bond, which is an Employee Retirement Income Security Act bond that we're required to carry. It's fairly small amount. And then we have 9 notaries at UTA, and we've had a couple of them renew this year, but we provide their bond, $25,000 bond for all of our notaries. Next slide, please. And so this is a summary of the program this year. You can see some of the changes in premium. The bottom line is that our premiums went up about 13% this year, largely because of the increase in the railroad liability. Since it's our largest premium that we pay, any changes in the railroad coverage usually will affect our total overall premium increases. So are there any questions?
Any questions from the board for Dave? I just would add, Dave, thanks to you and your staff, and certainly Brian and their efforts on our behalf. It's never any fun to shop for insurance. Well, it's never any fun when the premiums come higher.
Right.
So once in a while you get surprised. And I think the fact that you're able to work out a van-pool solution that helps us think that issue through and stuff, it could be worse, and you certainly would much rather have the coverage than not. So thanks for your efforts there.
All right. Thank you very much.
All right.
I appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
With that, we're going to take roughly a 10-minute recess. So about 10:35, we'll get started again and finish the remainder of our meeting. Thank you. We welcome you back, and we'll continue our other discussion items for the remainder of our Board of Trustees meeting. Item B that is up next is an update on our 2021-2025 Mobility Service Plan overview. And with that, we'll turn some time over to Mary Diloreto, as well as Laura Hanson, our our Director of Planning. Good morning.
Thank you, Chair. So our planning group has been working very hard on preparing the 5-year mobility plan, working in conjunction with all our business units and communications group and others throughout the agency. And they are going to present just an overview today. And we are going to give the same presentation to the local advisory council later this month. And then before the end of the year, we will have this plan ready to go for your review and approval. But I'm going to turn it over to Laura, and she's going to present an overview of where we are on the plan.
Thank you, Mary, and members of the board. I am happy to be here with you today. It's been a little while since we've been together talking about planning. We had a pretty good flurry of planning presentations last year, and we took a little break, and now I'm back. So if you could go to the next slide, please, Jana. I wanted to spend my time with you today just giving you kind of a refresher of our planning processes, the tools that we have in place, and kind of the various different steps that we go through as we're developing our 5-year plans. The first of which is a service planning policy. This is a board policy adopted by you, and I'll spend some time going through that today. And then we have some other tools available to us. We have a planning overview document that describes kind of the various different steps in our planning processes, things that we look at. We have service design guidelines. These set productivity standards for our individual bus routes so we can gauge whether a route is meeting its standards or not. We have a bus stop master plan that prioritizes where we spend and should place bus stop improvements. And then we have our 5-year mobility plan that we are in the development of right now. And finally, a comprehensive system analysis, which takes a look at all of the services within our system and evaluates them against the service design guidelines and other factors to determine whether they're on track or not. So Jana, if you could go to the next slide. So I wanted to spend some time just talking really through the service planning policy and our planning process today. We have 4 phases in our planning process that begin with a 4-year strategic planning process. This is the development of the Regional Transportation Plan, the RTP. This is a process that's managed by the local MPOs. UTA participates heavily in the development of the RTPs, but this is not a planning process that's really held here within UTA. And so that planning process is really looking out 30 years into the future at major capital development projects, new rail lines, new BRTs, things like that. Everything that falls below the level of those major capital projects, such as local bus service, falls into the next phase in our planning process, which is the service planning process. And this is where we develop the 5-year mobility plan. We update this every 2 years. The planning process here closely mirrors the process for the RTP, so we can sync up with those planning efforts every 2 years, which works well. And then the outcome of what we develop in the 5-year planning process goes into an operations planning process, which is where we're looking at annual service changes each year with our change day process, and then finally to implementation. And I'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail. Next slide, please, Jana. So in the RTP planning process, I mentioned Wasatch Front Regional Council and the Mountain Land Association of Governments manage this planning process, but we work very closely with them. We just completed the last update to the RTP, and so the next one will be released in 2023. But this planning process is very community driven. It starts with establishing goals, developing scenarios with local stakeholder input, developing scenarios, endorsing that, and outreach. This comes back to it the MPO Technical Advisory Committee and to their policy committees for actual approvals. So this is a plan that is developed by the communities for the communities and approved by the communities. Next slide, please. Then we get into the 5-year mobility planning process. And again, this is everything that falls under the threshold of what is in the RTP. We have a similar process where we start by developing some goals at the very beginning. We have a lot of community input in this planning process. We develop a draft plan, receive more public input on that, and then finalize the plan. State statute requires that our local advisory council approve a service plan at least every 2.5 years, and so that happens in this phase. And then they would recommend approval to this body, and you would have the final approval authority on that. Next slide, please. So we started, if you recall, a planning effort called UTA Service Choices, and this was really our first effort at the second phase in developing the 5-year mobility plan. We, if you recall, hired a consultant, Jarrett Walker Associates, to assist us with this. We had a ton of public outreach. We had surveys, community workshops, pop-up booths like you see in the image here, and we had over 3,500 people participate in this planning process. One of the topics that we really focused on in our education and outreach was the trade-off between route system design that focuses on maximizing ridership, but not serving as many places, but serving more people, as compared to coverage-based services, which focus on serving as many places as possible, but not necessarily maximizing the number of people or riders that use the system. And so we went through this great planning process, and then, of course, the pandemic hit. Next slide, please. And so we were all ready with our service choices planning process to kind of unroll a draft plan, a draft 5-year plan, bring that to the local advisory council and the community to review and comment on. And then we had the COVID pandemic, which had made us hit pause. We wanted to reevaluate what resources we had as an agency to put towards service and recalibrate our plans to make sure that we were staying within our current budget targets. And also we were watching some trends in ridership and travel patterns, and we were noticing that there are some shifts in the way that people are using public transit during this period as they were before, as compared to before the pandemic. For example, we are seeing a lot more midday ridership demand and less peak commuting time demand. And so we were at this interesting situation where we had to pivot. We were all ready with this plan, and we said, oh my goodness, we need to stop and just take a pulse and take another look at this plan. And so we pulled together the service choices effort, information from other pilot projects, rider surveys that were conducted as part of the COVID recovery process, a lot of ideas from our business units and other planning processes, and then again, just data analysis. And we put all of this into a funnel and said, okay, given all that we know today, now what should be our 5-year plan moving forward? And that's what we're in the middle of working on right now. Next slide, please. So as we were developing the 5-year draft plan, and we're still refining that. It's not quite ready to share with you yet, but we hope to bring it to you soon, as Mary mentioned. There were a handful of things that we kept in mind as we were developing that plan. First, we wanted to make sure that we were adapting to meet the needs of a changing transit market. I mentioned more midday service and less peak commuters. We wanted to create a network of high-frequency transit to drive ridership and make transit more useful. This is going back to service choices and some of the information that we heard from that process. We wanted to explore new roles for on-demand services like flex and microtransit. Given the fact that we have this probably once-in-a-career opportunity to take a really good look at our service and maybe make some adjustments when everybody in the whole region is making adjustments to their routines, we thought maybe there are some opportunities to find new roles for some of these new technologies. We wanted to make sure that we were bringing our service back within reduced budget targets. We, as you heard in the financial report, we have less resources coming in. Things are looking good, but UTA is wanting to be cautious and not overextend and make sure that the service that we put on the street is something that we can sustain long term. And then we want it to be flexible in the timeline. It is unclear with this pandemic exactly what's going to happen. We may have another situation where things flare up again. And so we want it to be very flexible in when we suggest implementing specific service changes to be able to adapt to school closures, schools openings, and various different shifts like that. And the last point is we want to be prepared and expect for things to change. What we put together today in this 5-year plan may not make sense 2 years from now, which is why we constantly update it. And so we're working to be very flexible. Next slide, please. So it's important to remember that the 5-year plan is only the second phase in this 4-phase planning process. So everything that we bring back to you in this draft 5-year plan later this fall will still go through several other steps. The next one in the process is the operations planning process. That will include outreach to affected local governments, where we reach out and say, these are the changes that are proposed that affect your community. We want to be out in front of those community members and city councils and mayors and talking to them about why we're making the changes that we are and how we're trying to serve those communities in the most effective way possible. And I hope that we can receive some board leadership in some of those meetings moving forward. So we'll be talking about that. Then we go through an operations planning process where we may have situations where we find a transfer isn't working just quite right. And so we'll need to make a tweak to a particular route. We'll have public hearings as we implement each of these changes. So the public will have an opportunity to comment on each change before it happens. We'll go through a revision to the plan based on that feedback. We'll do a Title VI analysis to make sure that we're not disproportionately impacting minority or low-income populations. And then it will come back to you for approval before those changes are made. Next slide, please. And finally, implementation of the service. We have 3 change days per year right now. These are typically April, August, and December of each year. Going back to my being flexible, given the pandemic and the uncertainty of things, right now we are trying to drive most of the main changes to these major change days, but at the same time be able to watch the data, watch where we're having crowding on specific buses, and be nimble enough to make change midstream. And so you may expect to see a few changes where we add an additional bus or an additional trip on a route because we're seeing ridership or loads that are not allowing for social distancing. So we're being flexible, but for the most part, this 5-year plan will be organized into years rather than into change days. So we'll be able to expect these are the changes that we think we're going to be doing in 2021. These are the changes we think that we'll be doing in 2022. But those may all shift from change day to change day and may be flexible based on current conditions. Last slide, I think, after this, yes. So I just wanted to reiterate that this 5-year plan that we'll be bringing to you will represent our anticipated service changes. It's based on the very best information that we have today. We'll learn more in coming months. Ongoing analysis is most certainly going to change our thinking and result in modifications to the plan, but this is the best that we can do right now. And every single change in the plan is going to go through its own planning process. So what you see in this document will not be written in stone forevermore. There is still a lot of work to come before anything in this plan ends up on the street. And I believe that's my last slide. I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have.
Laura, I assume this is somewhat financially constrained in the sense that, I mean, I'd love to go around saying, well, in 5 years, yeah, we'll do this or this and this, and you go down through the list, and then when 5 years comes up, everybody asks you why you didn't do that. And money may be an underlying restriction. To what degree is it financially constrained, and how are you looking at that as you look at options?
That's a great question. Yes, it is a financially constrained document. We worked closely with the CFO's office to develop some budget targets of anticipated revenue and anticipated expenses each year between now and 2025. Those are calibrated to match our new projections of revenue, reflecting a decrease in sales tax revenue as well as fare box recovery, but slowly recovering over time. And so we did use those budget targets. Everything that's in this plan fits within those budget targets. In addition, we've left a 4% contingency between our budget and what we put together in the allowable resources. Because sometimes as we get into the operations planning, we'll find, you know what, we really need to add one more bus and one more operator to make the cycle time on this particular route work. And that has a financial component to it. And so we wanted to leave some wiggle room there. So yes, financially constrained, but also conservative with that contingency in there as well.
And then I'll go ahead, Beth, and then I'll come back to my question.
Okay. Thanks. Laura, I love this. And I know that it's been definitely a lot of dialogue going on pre-COVID. And then, of course, with your having to be, nimble in regards to the pandemic, we really appreciate it. I really love the concept of working towards that frequency component that you talked about. Because we have found that a lot of communities have said to us, either anecdotally or in actual public meetings, it's how can I get to where I need to go as quickly as possible, obviously quickly being a relative term. And I'm just wondering if when we look at bus routes that are maybe a little longer in length or commuter in length, how does that shape into that? And then on your core routes, that are like I'll talk about like Salt Lake, Second South, the number 2, the number 9, whatever. How do those, I would like to, I guess my question is kind of blending those two. I'd really like to see us have some cohesive way of looking at like a more of a commuter type as becoming a core route, knowing that there's limitations. And then of course the whole frequency thing is relative. I guess, does that factor into anything that you're looking at this point, or is it a little not quite defined yet, or how is it that would be impactful? Maybe you didn't understand my question because I'm sorry I rambled a little bit, but I really just like to see that frequency and then that existence of that, once we've defined this kind of as a core route because it's got these certain other parameters, that's what I'd like to see on other routes as well. So I'm just curious about that.
Thank you. I think I do follow your question. We have been working towards a kind of sort of a general philosophy in this planning process of a network of core routes that have very high frequency service, longer hours. So they start early in the morning, they run late in the evening, 7 days a week. Those really are geared towards the routes that we're assigning that category to really are those kind of workhorse service routes that we really see a lot of midday ridership on them, as opposed to commuter services. That said, we are thinking very carefully about people who are commuting longer distances. I know you represent Davis and Weber counties, for example, and a lot of those people are traveling to Salt Lake every day for travel. And so one of the things that we've been paying close attention to is how can we best serve the people who are making those long distance trips? At the same time, being able to consolidate our resources so that we're not having 2 parallel routes right next to one another to serve slightly different markets, but then neither of them can run quite as frequently. So if we can combine those resources into a single corridor that has more service on it, that is a way to help elevate the frequency, reduce travel times for people while still serving some of those commuter markets. This is another opportunity where we can combine some of those core routes along with new technologies like microtransit, for example. There may be some opportunities within the area that you represent where some sort of new innovative mobility solution might pick up the people in a particular area and transport them to a corridor where we have a high frequency route. Rather than running lots of parallel individual routes that take people directly from their home directly to their destination. It requires a transfer, but it allows us to use our resources in a little bit more economic way and serve people just as efficiently. But that is a sticking point that we are continuing to work through and striking the right balance there. And I look forward to working with you and the local governments in those particular areas as we work through the details.
I really appreciate that. Thank you so much. You did touch on exactly what I was really looking to see. So thank you.
Laura, when it comes time to go to the advisory council, will they have a pretty clear idea, whether it's 5 years from now or a couple of years from now, which routes might be new or have more service on them? I mean, will they be left with a lot of doubt, or will it be fairly straightforward to them?
Thanks. That's a great question. We plan to come back to them just next month with this exact same presentation, just kind of a refresher, catching us up from the last time we visited with them. So that's our first touch point with them is really just bringing people up to speed on what's happened since the end of the service choices process when we spoke to them last. When we come back later in the year in November, we plan to have a very robust document. Actually, we're looking at an ESRI story map similar to our COVID recovery story map dashboard on our website that's very dynamic, that talks about kind of our guiding principles, but then has some maps where we can really scroll back and forth and see changes before, changes afterwards. It's very interactive. You can click on a route. It will tell you exactly what the service changes are on that. And so we hope to be able to provide as much specificity as we can in that planning document so that there are not surprises and people really understand exactly what's being proposed. Again, this big caveat, everything in this plan is likely to change. It is our best guess as of today, and future planning or phases in the planning process will refine those changes, and so it's the best information that we have right now.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you. Ken, did you have a question?
Yes, Laura, as you know, we've got a number of studies that are ongoing now and just getting started. Especially down here in Utah County, but across the entire agency. The Central Corridor Study, the South County, the Eagle Mountain, Saratoga Springs. As those studies are completed within this 5-year mobility plan, what's the process of absorbing those findings into this mobility plan as we move forward and as this 5-year rolls forward?
Thank you for that question, Trustee. Yes, you're right. There are a lot of things that are being planned from new BRT lines and various different studies. We've been trying in this 5-year planning process to think about those and start to lay the foundation for some of these service changes. So for example, Route 850 in Utah County, which matches up with the Central Corridor Study, is a route that we're recommending high frequency service on. And really sort of doubling down on our very best routes in preparation for the results that come out of that planning process. There are several others like the Mid-Valley Connector, South Davis Connector, where we're making some preliminary route changes that lay the foundation for those future changes when those projects come online. Because we update this planning document every 2 years, we will constantly be refreshing it and bringing those ideas into the plan as they are completed. Right now, we tried to keep things kind of in our side view mirrors, but unless we had concrete recommendations, you don't see a lot of changes right in this document that start to anticipate. We're laying the foundation for things. We're anticipating those coming on, but we have, for example, not included the South Davis Connector in the 5-year plan because we don't have a final plan yet. So when we have a final plan, it will get rolled in, if that makes sense.
Great. Any other questions from the board? I'm not seeing any. Laura, thank you for that update, and we'll look forward to the more detailed discussion in the months to come. So good luck with that.
Thank you very much.
All right, we'll see you. Thank you. That brings us to our next item, which is a front runner strategy and work program, and we'll turn to Carolyn Ganot and Manjeet Renu, who will take us through our approach about working forward on our planning there. Carolyn?
Okay, so thank you. So I just wanted to bring this forward to you. We have been looking at how we would move front runner forward to overall at some point double tracking, or if there's necessary where we would need additional tracks going forward, and what the vision is for front runner. So we've actually determined to try to do a business plan, but at the same time try to determine what investments do we want to make in the shorter term to be able to start producing more frequent and more reliable service, and potentially faster as well. So we have a work program where we would go out with a series of contracts and consultants, and this is really to get us to that visioning process, as well as some little more detail around the specifics for us to invest into the front runner system in the next next 3 to 10 years. So I'm going to turn this over to Manjeet. He's the Director of Capital Projects, to go through the presentation.
Well, thank you, Carolyn, and good morning, Board of Trustees. You may hear the sound of progress behind me for the Depot District, so apologize if you hear a fair amount of background noise. So we can go to the next slide, please.
Can you hear me?
All right, so I'm going to go over how we could go through a process for growing front runner capacity, a strategy and work program, and this is conceptual right now. Next slide, please. That's a little bit of background. You see the front runner service that y'all are familiar with as the purple north-south line. It's right in the center of our rail network and the center of our region. It is a vital transportation backbone for the Wasatch Front and a key alternative to the Interstate 15 freeway. It provides transportation choice as well, and freedom for those for which transit is the only transportation option. There has been additional investment contemplated in the regional transportation plans prepared by our metropolitan planning organizations, and has been previously studied, and that information from our regional partners and from the studies that UTA has done will be informative for this work program. Front Runner, of course, strongly supports economic development and access to opportunity, and you heard earlier about how strongly resilient the Utah economy has been in the face of some unprecedented challenges, and the area continues to grow significantly. And I am an example of that growth, having come here from Southern California. UTA's service area is indeed forecast to double in population by 2065, so the time to really look at how we can improve and grow the capacity of Front Runner is now. Next slide, please. So some of the service objectives in this preliminary phase of the project here is to look at faster trains, so how we can move the trains more quickly, to add additional trains during peak periods, and frequent service during the day, perhaps as frequent as 15-minute service. And with all that, to increase capacity of the trains in terms of the cars, as well as the frequency that helps to increase overall capacity, and even looking at what we call skip stop operations or express train services. Next slide, please. Some of the regional objectives that have been articulated for some time for the Front Runner service are to provide additional options to connect jobs and employees. Many of the Front Runner stations are multimodal and provide connections to surrounding residences, jobs, and activities. And additionally, transit-oriented development opportunities as well. Other regional objectives include increasing ridership on front runner, and therefore with the connections, the overall transit system. Again, to support real estate and economic development, which is crucial. The linkage between land use and transportation directly influences the opportunity for economic development. Reduce congestion on the 15 freeway corridor. A lot of improvements have occurred along the 15 freeway corridor, but congestion continues to be an issue with growth in the region, and the front runner provides a key alternative to travel along the 15 freeway. Improving air quality is, of course, very important for our region, which has some challenges to air quality year-round, and also to enhance safety at grade crossings, and that's important for the safety of life and property, but also improving safety enhances reliability of the front runner service and the overall transit system. Next slide, please. So the purpose of the vision is it's a conceptual framework that can guide the approach to preparing this strategy and work program for growing front runner capacity. And what it is, in essence, is it's a high-level synopsis of the overall program, and it will be based on the business plan. So it's iterative. In one sense, it provides some direction to the work program and what we want to do. In the other sense, it provides a summary of it. And with that, it can be a useful communication piece for what UTA and its project partners are seeking to accomplish with this effort to grow the capacity of front runner. Next slide, please. The business plan, a little bit about what we mean by the business plan. So the background is that it's a plan that we will continuously prepare and regularly update beginning soon after the initiation of this work program. It describes the service to be provided and implemented in phases. It references the policy, regulatory, and technical work involved, and it discusses how the engagement process informed the business plan. The technical high-level components of the business plan include preparing and outlining financial scenarios based on the type and delivery of that service. It looks at forecasting ridership, the capital costs for delivering the program, operations and maintenance costs for, of course, operating it, and expected revenues by the many sources that will take to build out a program as ambitious as front runner. It transparently, and that's important, transparently discloses and assesses potential risks and uncertainties in terms of the actual development of the improvements to front runner, and also the funding and financing framework for front runner. So being transparent and honest about what's involved will help us be more strategic and successful in actually achieving delivery. The business plan informs the business case and investment decisions, ultimately about where to place finite resources to ultimately achieve the best results that we can. And it also calculates potential economic and fiscal impacts and benefits. Next slide, please. So this is a technical overview of the front runner next steps professional services strategy. So where this will end up is in the initial request for proposals for the first step of this multi-step work program that's outlined here. So I'm going to go beginning with the next slide, please, with an overview of each of these steps. So step one is the on-call planning and simulation assistance. And so what we mean by that is to explore operational scenarios where we would create a computer model to simulate front runner operations as they exist today. And with that base of information, then we would be able to simulate different future operating services, as well as potentially different rail technologies, including supporting technologies for that. So this really helps us to explore ideas to inform what's reasonably possible, and then to go into the next slide, please. Step two, which is the project implementation plan and program management. And what this involves is preparing and studying infrastructure concepts that are based on those reasonable scenarios that meet the objectives for growing the capacity of FrontRunner. So in this, we would undertake conceptual planning and engineering to identify the components that are needed to implement those potential operating scenarios. And with that, prepare conceptual cost estimate ranges. And then we would be able to screen the most promising infrastructure concepts that support those scenarios. And with this step, we would also have a project management and program management component because there are lots of pieces to this overall work strategy. So having professional services support to help guide and oversee and manage the program will be important as well. Next slide, please. So step 3 involves environmental design and construction projects. So there are really 2 components to this step. The first part involves the regulatory clearances, and that includes environmental review. Since likely federal funds would be sought for a project like this, we would be working with our Federal Transit Administration partner in Region 8 to prepare a NEPA document, an environmental impact statement. And to do that, we would need to be undertaking engineering design, and that involves surveying and designing the project at a level that's needed to inform the business plan, the environmental review, and ultimately construction of the identified early action projects in this work program. And with that information, we would be able to conduct some strategic implementation planning to understand how to sequence a work program and a strategy for funding and financing it, and identify the project design packages that constitute those distinct phases. Next slide, please. And so this is the second component of the step, which is what looks to be the exciting part, which is constructing these early action projects where we're talking about project delivery now, where we determine the funding, financing, and delivery methods for the overall program and the early action projects that's based on the business plan and also informs the business plan, as that's an iterative component to this. And then ultimately construct and operate those early action projects. Next slide, please. And for a work program like this, we would be relying on some outstanding professional services as well as the excellent know-how that we have in-house. So best practices and lessons learned from both our own FrontRunner work program as well as across the globe, and how systems like this are best developed and operated, and some key lessons learned. So hopefully we don't make the same mistakes that others make. And some mistakes will be made in a complex program such as this. So we would be relying on expertise, including those highly qualified, innovative professional services, and our outstanding UTA operations know-how. We would be looking at case studies and similar systems again across the globe, and creativity, those approaches and methods that can rapidly and effectively implement the business plan, and importantly in harmony with our partner communities, because they are key to helping to deliver an outstanding project, and that's linked quite strongly and positively with land use and therefore economic development that advances opportunity for all in our region. So those partnerships, again, will be key to advancing our business plan. And then all along the way, how we engage with and communicate with stakeholders and being transparent is key to delivering the business plan. So next slide, please. And that is the last slide. So with that, I just want to acknowledge there are a couple of staff that are available for some technical questions. And I'll turn it over to our executive director for any final comments before the board. If you have discussion and questions, we'd be happy to.
Right. So, thank you, Manjeet. I want to just go back quickly to who's ever operating the slides, to go back to the one with the schedule. I just want to cover something real quickly on that, and then we can have comments on that. So
I think, Jana, that was probably the first slide in this
it was
series.
somewhere like a first, like fifth slide or something. I think right after that. Yeah. On the next one, that one. Okay, if we could just, so really what we will be looking at is trying to go out for some consultant resources. So this is some of our strategy for going forward, and it is steps that go along with what we want to do. The first is that we're ready soon to put out the pre-procurement or put the RFP out for the on-call operations planning and simulation assistance. That really will help us define sort of what get sort of a model running, a barrel simulation model, so we're able to see what kind, if depending on the kind of service we want to run, what kind of improvements that we would need. And then the next piece that we would go out for consultants, which we plan on probably getting that RFP at just a couple months, would be the project implementation plan, which they would sort of develop those concepts and then move that forward into some level of being able to package a program or a project to move into construction or environmental design and construction. And we probably would do quite a bit of the environmental ourselves in-house, but then we would put those projects out. And then meanwhile, underlying that would be the strategic business plan moving forward and underlying, and there'll be community engagement throughout that time frame. So I just want to, and that's more the visioning for the long haul for the next 20 years, 25 years to see, to build out our system and where we would want to be, understanding we really truly are the the backbone, the front runner to the for the passenger rail system that's throughout this region. So that's our steps for doing that, and we just want to have any questions, because you will start to see some RFPs going out on the street over the next few months.
Carolyn, a couple of questions I have. And first of all, thank you, you and Manjeet, and I know Bruce and Carrie are also on tap. A lot of the sort of operational analysis and modeling would help us regardless of where we go with this. I mean, I think we think we know the system, but it's always good when you get somebody to take a second look at it and make some recommendations, and maybe even some of the projects that could come after some of the engineering might fit in our normal capital program that are incremental but are helpful. But there is a point where really to get the ultimate goals, you would have to enter into a pretty major capital piece that would entail, a combination probably of federal, state, and maybe local participation at some point. Is there a point sort of where you wouldn't go any further without that assistance in this chart?
We would move forward, I would say, as we start to get into the final design of a package. Right now, we have the planning money to get us moving on the on-call operations work and the project implementation side, the strategic business plan. But I think once we get into the heavy design of it, to go into a package, we'd hire a designer to do that work, and then we go out for construction. Those are the steps that we would need. So we're talking about sort of looking at mid next year, where we would need to see have another funding source to do the larger, implementation packages.
Yeah. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Any questions from the board?
So just so I can just make sure that I understand this, I thank you again for going through all of this. I think that this is incredibly helpful for me to kind of get a perspective of where these steps will lead us to that next, to those bigger pieces on this. When we talk about some of the structure, and I'm just wanting to kind of define that a little bit more. The on-call operations planning and simulation assistance, which is the first, I guess, phase, if you will, that is really designed to look at the whole entire system. Is that correct? and to really like show optimization, show different times of things that can really add the value, which I know we've had discussions about skip stops and other things, but that's where we're going to get real good data to then move forward on everything. Or are those simultaneous and you wait to the project implementation portion?
So I can start, Manjeet can finish. So I think that what we're trying to look at now is based on, the service we would want to run, using the operations planning tool to sort of define sort of what type of infrastructure we would need. So they would simulate the existing system and then bring on future improvements to try to run the service that we have. It is going to be iterative because they might come up with one concept, then the engineering designer that's defined in the project implementation plan doing the concept would then look at that. Something might be more difficult to handle. There might be other ways to accomplish what we want to do. So it will be iterative. Manjeet, do you want to jump in on this one? Because part of it is really starting to develop this model, and it's a different way for us to think. What we're trying to say is this is the service we want to run, not this is what the project we want to build. So it's a different question. We're starting at what is the service we want to run and what kind of project do we need to build to run that service?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Carolyn. It's really creating that base computer model of how FrontRunner exists today and gathering a lot of information there, and then we can go and start to play around with different service concepts, and that can then give us an idea of what is viable to start looking at. Then with later contracting, what we should start looking at conceptual engineering to see what would be involved in deploying a variety of different service concepts. And if you'd like to know a little bit more about this modeling, Carrie Doan is on the video call, and she can get into a little bit more technical information if that would be helpful.
Yeah, that would be helpful. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. Yes, thank you, Manjeet and Carolyn. Beth, I think your question is, kind of what does the model do for us in relation to the other contracts? Yes, I see a nod.
Yes.
I think Manjeet explained it fairly well, and Carolyn as well, with this iterative process. I think the piece that may help is that the model will assess what one service idea might do to the rest of the system. One thing we've learned from FrontRunner is that when there's a delay in one place, it dominoes into the whole system. So maybe an example would help. If we were to add a train, maybe from Ogden to Salt Lake City in the morning peak, the model can not only tell us where the trains will be crossing and what infrastructure we may need to add to make that happen, it will also tell us what's going to happen the whole rest of the line throughout the rest of the day. How long will it take to recover? Things like that. So that's just like those short terms. And then we can also use the model to kind of see what would be our vision service beyond just those one or two improvements we want to make more quickly. And how would it run all day long if we were to change it more fully? And then, as you can see, there's like business unit assistants at the end. Bruce and the team are always looking for ways to tweak their system, and the model would be able to tell us what would happen if we make those tweaks. Does that help?
That's very helpful. I also think, and correct me if I'm wrong on this, I know that it would also look at the actual modes that we would use, whether we would need new train sets or whatever. But also, does this include that, as Carolyn talked about, FrontRunner is that kind of that backbone piece, and does that include the connectivity from those stations via, say, bus, or maybe it's a microtransit model or some other component? Because that's, I think, the connectivity piece is really a critical element to enhancing this even more.
Is this one for me, you guys? I think that this is an operation simulation model, so the short answer is no. That's sort of, I think you're asking about ridership, right? How does the connectivity of the system ridership? and this is not a ridership model. It's strictly an operations simulation model. And we can definitely assess how changing the train itself, whether it's the propulsion of the train or the length of the train, that definitely has an impact on how it operates and how slowly or quickly it accelerates and decelerates. And that is the sort of detail that this simulation provides that simpler models do not.
That is very helpful. I appreciate that. I do recognize the value of having a good infrastructure in place on operations side, because obviously if that's not in place, then any connectivity would obviously not be as good either. So thank you. And I appreciate the clarification from all of you.
Carolyn, I'm assuming as we do this modeling that the assumption is that our current propulsion system with the engines and even car makeup is not at least likely to change on the forefront of this, and or would it have to assume that we would be looking at replacement?
We would, what will tell us is how many vehicles we need, and what, if we need other vehicles, what kind of system do we need? Do we think we'll change the propulsion system within the first 10 years? Unlikely, but we don't know that. A big portion of the business plan is to vision sort of where we might be going with the front runner system, electrifying, and what options will be available. And those are the discussions we'll be talking about as part of the visioning process. So I do think the business plan will dive into potentially, a different propulsion system, or when we would, and also when we might want to make those changes.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions from the board at this point?
No questions, just an encouragement. This really looks good. I think this is going to be a great addition to thinking about front runner.
And we also realize this is probably one of many discussions still to come, and with all our other stakeholders as well. So, well, thanks for that update, and we'll look forward to future presentations as well. All right. Thank you. With that, I think that brings us to our last discussion item, which is a potential issuance and sale of sales tax revenue and refunding bonds. And we'll bring back Troy Bingham, and I know he'll be accompanied by Brian Baker, who's our advisor with Science Public Finance. Troy?
Chairman, this is Troy Bingham. We have been presented with an opportunity in the last week to refund some of our 2012 bonds. Hopefully Brian Baker is online and we can hear him. And he's got a short presentation for you guys to show.
I'm here. How's everybody doing? I just wanted to quickly talk, and we had a call last week that some of you were on, but basically the idea was last October we presented to the State Bonding Commission and previously to the Local Advisory Council the prospect of borrowing money to fund the capital plan, which was, I think it was only $50–60 million, and then also borrowing money to refinance bonds that could be done for saving money and also for slightly restructuring the Utah Transit Authority debt to bring down your maximum debt level in the future. And so last year we had $540 million approved. We issued bonds in the fall of 2019, and then again there was an opportunity to finish that up in 2020 early. So we issued all of the bonds that we were authorized to issue. And there was one small section of about $73.6 million worth of bonds from 2012 that we had actually thought previously were going to be part of what we refinanced. But the way the dynamics of the market changed, we ended up not doing those. And so we've kept them kind of on our radar, looking at things. And I think the next screen, I think, shows what the potential savings are that we're looking at. So it's essentially $73.6 million of bonds that would be refinanced from your 2012 issuance. After this refinancing, the 2012 bonds would basically cease to exist because we would have refinanced every single aspect of that debt issuance, and they'd be replaced with a new debt issuance. And when you line up the debt service that you would be paying on these existing debt versus what we estimate you would be paying on the new debt, And again, those numbers of what you actually would save are still variable. We ran numbers about a month ago prior to Bob's retirement, and the numbers were a little higher. They were a little over 10%. And so the market will continue to move. But it seemed to me that this would have been an opportunity that if we had these sorts of savings on them, either this past spring or in the fall of 19, when we did those original refinancings, that the board, based on the things that they had said, my feeling was you probably would have wanted to refinance those at that time to take the savings that was available. And so we wanted to bring these back. We know there is a process that involves presenting to the local advisory council, meeting with the state bonding commission, in addition to the regular board approvals that UTA would need to go through to issue the bonds. And with the local advisory council meeting coming up in 2 weeks, once we discussed this issue, we thought, okay, this is kind of timely. We need to present to the board and see if we can get direction from them to go present this to the local advisory council and set up a meeting with the state bonding commission just to start that legal process. There's no resolution you're being asked to approve. There's no documents that legal counsel has drafted today. I think we're simply asking for direction on if there was a refinancing that was in the, this is in the 7.5% range, and hopefully with the ebb and flow of the markets, it would be better down the road. But is this something that you'd like us to start those initial meetings about and pursue if it remains in this sort of a range or better?
Brian, in the past, refinance having, I think, been done through taxable bonds, is that intended, the intent on these as well?
Yes, these would also be taxable bonds. And it's interesting that at certain times in the past, the difference between taxable and tax exempt rates has been significant. Actually, right now, with how compressed rates are, taxable rates are not punitive very much. In fact, we've done a couple of deals recently where there's some bureaucratic issues with tax exemption, and we have actually had a couple of issuers that just decided, you know what, my benefit with tax exemption is not that significant right now. I will go ahead and issue taxable bonds instead, just to make the bookkeeping and some of the other issues they have to deal with on the bureaucratic side a little easier to deal with. But these would be taxable bonds, yes.
And then I remember in the call last week that there was a discussion about sort of waiting until the normal call date. There's really it would be a high threshold to save more money than by waiting or by maybe going forward now. Can you speak to the timing of doing it now versus just waiting until a call date or some future date?
Yeah, the bonds are actually callable in about 2 years. So meaning in 2 years, you would be able to do tax exempt bonds to refinance them instead of taxable bonds. We can do a break-even analysis on how much rates would have to go up between now and then in 2 years for you to have been better off to wait. But typically, the market is where it is now. We are in a low rate environment. There is not any current expectation of rates going significantly higher, but we of course have stock market at all-time highs and the very, very unknown of what on earth happens with the election. And I couldn't tell you, based on whoever wins, what the response of the market might be and what that might do to the interest rate environment. So that is kind of hard to project at this time. That would certainly represent a spot where if you were going to have an inflection point of some kind, changes in the political structure, things like that, through the election, or even re-electing the same person could have impacts on the market that are unforeseen right now.
Questions from the board? Any?
More just a comment. I think, I appreciate constantly reviewing this because we have seen that such changes in the interest rates. And I recognize the high level of uncertainty given everything that you just mentioned, plus the uncertainty of COVID. So I do understand, and I think that ultimately it makes a lot of sense to me in terms of how we want to be managing our debt and making sure that it is as efficient as possible.
Ken, did you have a thought?
Well, I certainly think that it makes a lot of sense to move the issue forward and continue to look very carefully at this and be prepared as we see opportunities to refinance.
I'm not sensing any objection then for us going forward with our process, statutory process of reviewing it with the advisory council and then going to the State Bonding Commission. So,
great.
Unless others feel differently, let's go forward with that effort and hope that rates stay there.
A good move.
Okay. Well, sounds great.
Agreed.
Well, Brian, thanks for joining us and getting through the whole meeting.
It's always interesting.
Yeah,
I won't say that I was paying 100% laser focused attention to every issue, but it's always interesting to hear all the different things you have to deal with.
We're going to quiz you later. So, all right, Troy, anything from you?
Nothing new.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you both for that update, and we'll hope that things continue to move forward in a positive way. We would just note that our next meeting will be on September 23rd at 9 o'clock a.m. And with that, I'll entertain a motion for adjournment.
I move that we adjourn.
Second.
Motion from Kent, seconded by Beth for adjournment. All in favor, say aye.
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 Any opposed? That motion passes. So thanks everybody. Thanks to staff and our good friend Eric Vance for keeping us streaming on live. Take care and have a great day.
Thank you.
Thanks everybody.